Our next speaker is Dr. Laurice Jamero, who is the head of the Resilience Collaboratory of the Manila Observatory. The title of her deck is so arresting. We are not drowning, we are fighting. Shifting the focus from vulnerability to capacity. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Law a little bit more. Apart from working with the Manila Observatory, where she closely collaborates with local governments and civil society organizations to support climate and disaster risk management and adaptation efforts, she also works at the regional and international level, volunteering her time at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and also the Southeast Asia Science Advisory Network. We can see from all of this that Dr. Lau is very passionate about engaging vulnerable communities and understanding climate risks and designing possible solutions, building on existing adaptive capacities and creating hope for the future through collaborative climate action. Dr. Lau earned her PhD degree in sustainability science at the University of Tokyo, where she studied climate change adaptation in small island communities. And please welcome Dr. Laurice Jamero, who will be talking to us about communities that are saying, we are not drowning, we are fighting. Dr. Lau, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Anna, for the kind introduction. And yeah, I hope everyone is safe from the earthquake. All right. So Anna was, I think, talking about, me providing a kind of counter example about communities that are not really keen to migrate, but at the same time, I feel like it's more of focusing on how complex the issue really is. I also echo a lot of the message that Ms. Maureen said earlier regarding the role of remittances and the potential adaptive, adaptation option of seasonal and temporal migration. But then, yeah, this is really not as straightforward. And so this afternoon, I hope to be able to shed some light on the complexities of these issues, especially from the perspective of small island communities. So I'm not sure, but probably you've already seen this photo before. This photo is, I think, already 10 years old. And this is a photo of our brothers and sisters from the Pacific Islands, essentially protesting the label of climate refugees. They don't want to be called climate refugees. And so they staged this protest, shouting that, we are not drowning, we are fighting. This is really a reaction to the dominant narrative today, wherein you see headlines, even from this year, where the islands are being labeled as sinking or drowning or disappearing or will be erased. And this narrative is not only offensive for our small island communities, but actually it's also very harmful, because then you portray them as victims rather than survivors. And you also portray small island communities as a basket case, despite the fact that they have been resilient throughout their history. Imagine living under the precarious conditions of a small island, and they have done that for many, many generations. And this resistance persists today, even at COP27, so the latest climate conference. I was there in person, and I noticed that the small island developing state representatives are not even referring to themselves as small islands anymore, but rather as large ocean states. This is really to shift the narrative from vulnerability to highlighting the significant contribution that they bring to the table. Imagine being stewards of large ocean regions in the world, and how they are not just victims of climate change, but they are actually part of the solution in the climate crisis. So this is like the global overview of how small island communities think and feel about this issue. But let me zoom in on our story here in Bohol. So I'm actually calling in from Bohol. I'm a Boholana, and um, I think most of you would be familiar with our island. So it's a, it's a proper tropical island paradise. We have white sand beaches and all of those. But for me as a local, what really makes our island stand out is that the fact that we have the Nahon Bank, which is a double barrier reef up north. And there are only 6 double barrier reefs in the world. The most known would be Australia's Great Barrier Reef, but we actually have one here in our own backyard. It's just that it's not a tourism site. Their livelihood is more on fishing. All right, so this is just an aerial shot of what one of the islands look like. So here in the Nahon Bank, there are actually many small islets that are dotted across that. And I'm gonna talk about them this afternoon. All right, so what happened in our island? So first, let me talk about slow onset events, tidal flooding specifically. Actually, tidal flooding is one of the earliest impacts of sea level rise, which is a slow onset climate disaster. So it happened because of an earthquake. That's why I worry about the earthquake. The epicenter, I think, is somewhere along the coastline of Camarines Sur or Camarines Norte, because we experienced the same almost 10 years ago. So we had an earthquake, a 7.2 magnitude earthquake, which induced land subsidence in different coastal towns, reaching all the way to our islands. And as a result, they are now flooded during normal spring tides. So when you say spring tides, it's the high tides during the new moon and full moon of each month. So each month, they are flooded either completely or partially, depending on the actual tide level and also the local weather conditions. But that was in 2013, and we have been visiting these communities across all these years, and it has actually become worse there. And I'll tell you more about it later. But essentially, we're looking at 2 causes of tidal flooding. You have a local driver, which is an earthquake. In the context of places like Jakarta, their local driver is the groundwater extraction. They also experience land subsidence. But on top of that, there's also a global driver of tidal flooding, which is the accelerated sea level rise. And sea level rise is now virtually certain, and it's also irreversible. So even if we turn off all our fossil fuel emitting plants, tomorrow there will still be sea level rise at the end of the century. Okay, so there's tidal flooding almost every 2 weeks, and you can imagine that it has impacted the islands in so many ways. So these are just some photos of their schools that have been flooded. The waste, of course, that goes into the water. These islands do not have toilets in their own homes. They have communal toilets, and those toilets are also submerged in flood water. Their roads are also flooded, so that has an issue with mobility. But at the same time, you can see that life still goes on in these islands. Children still continue going to school. They even still raise livestock there. And at the same time, kids, when they see flood water, when the water is rising, is actually clear. It becomes muddy when it starts to pull out, when low tide sets in. So when children see that, oh, the water is coming, it's clear, then they just jump into the water. So when you see documentaries that are all doom and gloom, I think it doesn't really capture the spirit of the islands during flooding events. It's not that they're oblivious to the risk, but as I said, life goes on in these islands. And besides that, they have also developed different adaptation strategies in the past 10 years. So it's divided into two parts. So one is the retreat strategy and the other is the in situ strategy. So for the retreat strategy, they can permanently relocate or temporarily evacuate. Permanent relocation was one of the knee-jerk reactions of the municipal government. So they set up the relocation program. Funding was an issue, of course. But at the same time, it was not an attractive option for fisher folks because their livelihood is based on the islands. And unfortunately, the relocation program offered did not have any livelihood component at all. So it was just moving the islanders to the mainland, and that's it. So it encountered a lot of challenges with convincing people to move away from their livelihood, and it really stalled. To this day, there's not a single household relocated through the relocation program. And to this day, there's very little funding available for this relocation program. But it's good to know that, it's one of the options that are available. But rather than that, there are actually a lot of things that they are able to do as well on the island. And I'll go through them one by one. So one is temporary evacuation. So before, they only evacuated when the typhoon is very strong. But now, even if it's just a tropical depression and it's not even a typhoon yet, they do evacuate either to the mainland or some stronger structures on the island if it coincides with the high tide. All right, because a weather system coinciding with tidal flooding can be very dangerous for the island communities. So they change their evacuation behavior. So this is in times of those extreme events. But what about on the daily? So on the daily, they have community-based adaptation. So through the years, they started raising their roads. They shifted their housing to stilted housing. They repaired their classrooms by elevating their floors. There is an issue here because the only materials available on the island were coral stones. And so we actually help, bridge the program of the government with the need of the island communities. At least the government can provide the materials because there's really no materials on the islands, and what the communities can contribute are their labor instead, for example. They also use plastics differently in the island, and they elevate their belongings. So I'm not sure if anyone here is from Visayas or Mindanao, but our calendar always has tidal information. So I always grew up knowing that when it's a good time to go to the beach, I'll just look at the calendar and I know when the high tide is coming. And this became useful for the islanders, so they know when the tide is coming, so they elevate their belongings beforehand, and then they can time, how to set up their homes so that at least it doesn't get a lot of trash inside the home. They know when to start cleaning up, etc. There's also ecosystem-based adaptation or nature-based solution. This is now one of the biggest focus for small island, not just here in Bohol, but globally. The United Nations declared this decade as the decade of ecosystem restoration. And we're seeing a lot of commitments from large ocean states to conserve really thousands of hectares of their reefs to fight off risks from storm surges, but also to contribute towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So there's the reefs, there's also mangroves, and to some extent, there's coastal engineering in the small islands. But nowadays, it's usually not pure coastal engineering anymore, where they just build a seawall. Nowadays, they combine the green and gray infrastructure. It's kind of questionable whether seawalls are fit for islands. So if you know islands, they have sand mounds, sandbars that shift. Actually, they shift depending on the wave and the monsoons. So islands are always changing shape. And if you put seawalls around that, then they cannot naturally cope with, the waves and the monsoons anymore. And so there is a big question whether seawalls are appropriate for islands at all. All right. So this case here in Bohol actually became the first modern day case study of adaptation to sea level rise. Prior to this study, I think there was only one case in the US, and that was constructed from historical records from the 1900s. But here we're looking at what's happening in real time in the communities. Because of the study, we also highlighted local drivers of sea level rise, like land subsidence. So now you cannot attend a sea level rise conference where scientists are not talking about land subsidence and other local drivers as well. Now they always look at the local and global driver. And it really challenged the notion of, the limits of adaptation and the assumption that if there's tidal flooding, people will leave. If there's sea level rise, people will leave. It's never as simple as that. All right, but that sorry. So this helped somewhat change the narrative, from sinking islands to resilient islands and adapting islands. These are the terms that we want to be associated with islands. But unfortunately, these types of headlines are far between, but we're doing our best to change that. So from our side, our research team actually created a film project. If you're interested, you can check out this website. We've been showing this, especially in the negotiations. It's very important for the delegates to be able to see what the reality looks like on the ground. So here you have a 360 film, and you're actually walking through the flood water during an actual flooding event. And you'll see, as I said, the spirit of the island. Some are worried, some are not. It's very, very complex. All right, but that's just talking about slow onset events. So you might think that, oh, I'm sure if they are hit by a typhoon, then they will leave. Um, that wasn't the case as well with Super Typhoon Rai back in December 2021. So the islands were directly hit. Yeah, I was there when it happened. I was here in Bohol. And Super Typhoon Rai really caught us off guard. It rapidly intensified from category 1 to 5 in 24 hours. So the night before landfall, I was monitoring it. It was a maximum of category 2. In the morning, I woke up early because my colleagues were ringing me and telling me, Lau, the typhoon that's about to hit you is already a category 5 typhoon. So the forecast was available at 5 a.m. internationally via Pag-asa. It was broadcasted through the 8 a.m. bulletin, and the first landfall was at 12 noon. So remember, I talked about temporary evacuation and how islanders evacuate immediately. At that time, they were really struggling because the time was too short, and by the time that we received the forecast, it was not possible for us to cross to the mainland anymore. So it first hit Siargao, and then Bohol was sixth in line, and it hit us at 7:30 in the evening, and it almost coincided with the peak tide around 9:30 p.m., which added another 1.3 meters of water. So if you look here, the previous photo that I showed you, it actually affected, storm surge was the number one risk, the number one hazard, sorry, that really affected the islands. We did measure around the end of February the height of the waves across different islands, and for some islands it reached up to 4 meters high waves. So did they relocate? Well, the idea of permanent relocation became more, how to say, more attractive. They became more open-minded to it. Actually, the government, the first funding that came into the relocation program that was envisioned 10 years ago came after Super Typhoon Rai. That was the only time the funding became available. The people were more willing to relocate. Of course, they were traumatized by this extreme event. But again, it was not an overnight process where they just pack their bags and leave. As I said, no one has left the island through the relocation program yet, even today, even after Super Typhoon, right? And again, the reason is the concern for livelihood. The destination is going to be up in the mountains. And fishermen, when they want to go out, when they go out to the sea, they come back with fish. So they are used to that. If you ask them to farm, they have to wait 3 months to harvest anything, and that's if the weather is kind to you and you don't get attacked by pests. And as you know, in the last 3 years we have been having La Nina, so it's very, very, this livelihood concern is very, very how to say, important for the fisher folks. So they are open-minded, but right now they still haven't decided to go through the relocation program. And from the part of the government, they are also relenting in a way. At first, they want the communities to permanently leave their homes on the islands, but that just doesn't look possible. So now they are considering a hybrid approach wherein the communities can keep their houses on the island as a temporary house where they can stay and continue their fishing. But their permanent residence is going to be the relocation site, especially for women and their children who are already going to school on the mainland, and that would really work. And this hybrid approach is, one of the biggest compromise that allows both parties to be able to continue this discussion on permanent relocation. All right, so relocation, it's not a question of relocation is an adaptation option. It is one of many options, but the question is relocation with all of the risks that it carries, especially the risk of impoverishment and the risk of being removed from your social safety net. How can we make sure that it does not devolve into a maladaptive strategy? So now I'm showing this framework from the latest IPCC report, Working Group 2. It shows the continuum of adaptation to maladaptation. It's not a perfect science, but here you have some principles that you can follow to make sure that it doesn't become maladaptive. So there are 5 things that needs to be there. Number 1, it should benefit humans. So it should decrease vulnerability and increase capacity. Number 2, it should be good for the environment. So benefits to ecosystem services. Number 3, it should have an equity component. We should look at the most vulnerable sectors, the most marginalized sectors in our community. As Ms. Maureen highlighted, gender is one of those multi-facet of vulnerability. Next, it has to have transformation potential. Right now, with the amount of with the climate crisis that we are faced with, incremental solutions just doesn't cut it anymore. It has to be transformational. There has to be systemic change. So an adaptive solution would have to be transformative. And number five, it should also have mitigation co-benefits. So it should also reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So our pitfall when we plan adaptation projects is we focus only on one. Um, Most development projects focus only on benefits to humans. Most conservation on organizations only focus on ecosystems. But we need all of those. We need all of those five to make sure that we are not having negative unintended consequences like maladaptation. All right. So I guess I hope I still have a bit more time. I just want to wrap up my presentation with a discussion on loss and damage, because this is one of the key points that were discussed during the latest climate negotiations. There is a misconception that loss and damage only happens when we reach the adaptation limit. That is not true. In fact, loss and damage is already happening today, even with adaptation. And even if your adaptation is good, and even before reaching the soft and hard limits. That's why when you turn on the news, you see communities that have suffered from flooding or drought because loss and damage is already happening today. So what exactly is loss and damage? So loss and damage is simply the effect of climate change. It can be the effect from extreme weather events, or it can be the effects of slow onset events. It can also be classified as economic or non-economic. And I'd like to bring your attention to non-economic losses, which include human mobility, territory, loss of cultural heritage, loss of indigenous knowledge, loss of biodiversity, loss of identity. All of these are very real threats for our small island communities. Thankfully, with the latest negotiations, we made a very big step forward. So the small island developing states have actually raised the issue of loss and damage 30 years ago. But the agenda of loss and damage, only appeared for the first time in the official agenda of a UN climate change conference this year. It's the first time in the entire history of the climate change conference. And apart from that, we were able to have a breakthrough agreement on loss and damage funding. So Ms. Maureen said earlier that there are two pillars for climate action: adaptation, dealing with the effects of climate change; mitigation, dealing with the causes of climate change, which is greenhouse gas emission. And for me personally, I think the third leg is really loss and damage. This is also the third component of climate financing. So we already agree to have the fund. And so for COP28 and 29, so by 2024, we have to be able to figure out how to actually set up the fund and to make sure that it reaches directly communities. So that's the good news, and that's very important for countries like the Philippines. We're actually number 4 in the Global Climate Risk Index. But if you look at how they calculated the climate risk index, it's actually based on fatalities and losses in millions. In other words, it's based on loss and damage. And this data is for the past 20 years. So this tells us that Philippines essentially is number 4 for loss and damage. So the fact that there's going to be a loss and damage funding is very good news for us. The bad news is that the world is continuing to warm up fast. So right now we are already at 1.2 degrees warming level, 1.2 here. And our goal is to limit up to 1.5 maximum. No, that's the aspirational goal. And the maximum is 2 degrees. Although scientists like myself, knowing all of the risks that come with a higher temperature, we really want to keep it to 1.5 degrees only. Right now, we are headed towards a 2.7-degree warmer world with our current policies and action. And we already have a lot of targets, we have pledges, but in the most optimistic case, we will still reach 1.8 degrees Celsius. And this is, so the Earth is continuing to warm up. It means that we are continuing to emit greenhouse gas emissions, despite the fact that for climate finance, majority of the money is actually going to mitigation, low carbon development. So for 2019-2020, the investment for mitigation is 571 million. And adaptation is not even 10% of that. That's 46 million only. So it's very disappointing, especially for small islands. This is one of the recent studies from actually just September this year. And this is describing tipping points. So the tipping points that we risk hitting if we continue to warm up. And I'd like to bring your attention to this one, the die-off of coral reefs, which will happen below 2 degrees. So even if we stick within the Paris Agreement, we still risk hitting this tipping point. In fact, the numbers are at 1.5 degrees, we lose 70 to 90%, which is majority of our reefs. And at 2 degrees, we lose 99%, which is all of our reefs. And this is global, and this is not a temporary loss. This is a permanent loss. So this is a very, very big concern for us. There's also recent studies saying that we will overshoot 1.5 degrees. There's a 50% chance now that we will shoot over 1.5 degrees within the next 5 years. Already, the Great Barrier Reef in Australia has bleached 4 times since 2016. 4 times. And the last time that there was massive coral bleaching was last year, which is a La Nina year, which is supposed to be a cold year, but still there was mass bleaching. So that's for slow onset event. And what about for extreme events? Let's look at the example of tropical cyclones. So we still don't know about the frequency, if there will be more or less typhoons in the future, but we know about the intensity. We know that there will be more number of stronger typhoons in the future. So the typhoons are going to be supercharged. They are going to bring higher rain rates, and they are going to have higher storm surges because they are falling on higher sea level. And as I said, sea level rise is already virtually certain. So yeah, as I said, this afternoon, I wanted to present a counter example, not just for the sake of presenting a counter example, but to really look at the complexity of the issue of relocation. But for me, personally, there are so many things that we can do for small island communities aside from helping them prepare for relocation. So what about mitigation? What about cutting down our greenhouse gas emissions so that we keep warming below 1.5 degrees? How about investing more in adaptation, especially nature-based adaptation, which is the key focus of small islands? And lastly, how about compensating us for the loss and damage that we already suffered from climate change? So with that, I'd like to end my presentation, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Lau, for giving us an overview of so many different aspects of slow onset climate change. From the very start, I thought what was very important and relevant, especially to storytellers. Some are in the NGO community and are certainly storytellers, but also journalists, is how we should refrain or restrain ourselves from using the term climate refugees and recognize how that is disempowering. And I took so many notes how it could be offensive and harmful to small island communities, and not recognize how they are, through their own way, using coping strategies. I think to summarize your presentation would be how, yes, relocation is definitely an adaptation strategy, but we can't simply look at it from just the perspective of one aspect of relocation or movement. You showed us a continuum of factors, or a set of factors that have to be considered so that relocation doesn't cause more harm than it should. And actually, you know how, what also I think resonated with a lot of people is how personal the story is of climate-induced emergencies to you. You talked about how you had experienced Typhoon Rai yourself. So here you are, an expert talking at these different climate conferences, but also as someone who experiences climate-induced disasters on a personal level.